they were never meant to be found. In the dead of winter, 1851, a teacher named Elizabeth Hartwell unsealed a forgotten door beneath St. Catherine's Academy for Young Ladies. Behind it, 24 child-sized beds, rusted shackles affixed to every headboard, and scrawled across the stone wall in the trembling hand of a child, 5 words that have haunted Salem ever since: "We are still here." What Elizabeth uncovered should have shattered the foundation of New England society. Instead, it was buried, literally, stuffed into a mason jar and sealed behind the altar for over a century. When the jar was finally rediscovered in 1987 during renovations, it wasn't just a record of abuse. It was a map, a blueprint of something far older and far more organized than anyone dared admit. This is not the story of a haunted school. This is the story of a system, ancient, invisible, and ravenous, a machine dressed in Christian charity, fed with the lives of orphaned girls, and run by women who claimed to be brides of Christ, but served something far more monstrous. If you're listening right now, it means you've already sensed that something is wrong with the world around you, that the stories we're told, the histories we're handed, are only fragments, half-truths, sanitized legends fed to the masses, while the real power stays hidden beneath cathedral floors and behind schoolhouse doors. What happened at St. Catherine's Academy wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was a template, a prototype of institutional control, where faith becomes fear, obedience becomes silence, and innocence becomes currency. This is your descent into the hidden core of that template, into the gears of a forgotten factory that never truly closed. A place where young girls vanished by the dozens, not into the afterlife, but into systems of power so carefully constructed, their mechanisms still echo in our modern institution. No. So listen closely. What you're about to hear is dangerous. It is knowledge preserved in silence, passed in whispers, and punished by exposure. This isn't just a dark chapter in a forgotten ledger. It's a key. And once you turn it, there's no going back. Are you ready? Because what happened to the 18 orphan girls of St. Catherine's was not an accident. It was an offering. The academy itself was a fortress of deception, built of brick, crowned with crosses and sealed with lies. Founded in 1834, St. Catherine sat on Gallows Hill Road in Salem, Massachusetts, a name soaked in blood and superstition long before the academy's gates were ever opened. They told the townspeople it was a sanctuary, a place of healing for girls orphaned by cholera, factory fires, and railroad wrecks. But Gallows Hill has never been a place of mercy. It was the site of hangings during the witch trials, a mound of execution and accusation, and those who built upon it, whether knowingly or not, tapped into something far older than New England's Puritan fear. They built upon a wound in the earth, and the thing about wounds, they fester. The 3 women who ran St. Catherine's were no ordinary caretakers. They were architects. Mother Superior Victoria Whitman, cold, eloquent with the bearing of aristocracy. Sister Margaret Collins, gentle-eyed and maternal, masking horrors beneath hymns. And Sister Agnes Murphy, silent, strict, a master of ledgers and locks. They recruited girls between the ages of 12 and 17. The advertisements were beautiful, gilded, embossed with the seal of the archdiocese. They promised refinement, education, Christian love, but those promises were a snare. What the papers didn't say, what no parent knew, was that not a single girl who entered those gates ever came back out. 24 were recorded, 18 are unaccounted for. You must understand, this was not mere abuse, this was enterprise. Behind the prayers and piano lessons, behind the grey uniforms and scripture recitations, the academy operated like a perfectly engineered system of psychological control. The girls were stripped of identity, rewritten daily with obedience and shame. They were conditioned to accept pain as penance, silence as virtue, and surveillance as love. Most chilling of all, they were told that the outside world had forgotten them, that no family would ever come, that they had been chosen by God, and that their suffering was holy. It wasn't holy. It was harvest. Visitors never saw the 3rd floor. It was always locked. They never questioned why only new girls were seen, never the older ones, and they never asked where the donations were going. Or who else was benefiting from the silence? Because when darkness wears a rosary, people avert their eyes, and when power smiles behind stained glass, it gets away with anything. To truly grasp the horror of what was done inside those walls, you must understand the doctrine they preached, because it wasn't Christianity. Not really. It was control disguised as devotion. Every sermon, every scripture reading, every whispered bedtime prayer, it was all part of a grooming ritual more psychological than spiritual. The girls were told they were special, that they had been chosen from the filth of the world to be purified, trained, and transformed. But transformation always came with pain. To become light, Sister Agnes once wrote in her private ledger, one must first be broken in darkness. The breaking began early. Their names were changed, their hair cut to identical lengths, their voices punished if they spoke out of turn. If one girl disobeyed, all suffered. An ancient tactic of collective discipline meant to breed silence and fear. They were isolated from the outside world entirely. No letters out, no visitors in. Every stitch of their reality was sewn by the sisters' hands. But this wasn't chaos. This was a system so well practiced it had become ritual, and like any ritual, it demanded a sacrifice. In the academy's basement, beneath the chapel, through a corridor the townspeople believed was used for storage, there was a chamber, not large but cold and perfectly quiet. It smelled of iron and mildew, and on the walls, faint scratches, names, dozens of them, some unfinished, as though the hands that carved them were taken mid-word. At the center of this chamber stood what Elizabeth Hartwell would later describe in her buried testimony as an altar of iron and stone. Not Catholic, not Christian. Something older, something cruel. On it, candle stubs, bone fragments, lengths of cord worn smooth from repeated use, and behind it a false wall, inside which you would find those 24 child-sized beds, each chained to the floor like tiny eyes and cells, and next to each bed, a token, a doll with no eyes, a rosary with no crucifix, a lock of hair. This wasn't just neglect, this was devotion to an entirely different God, a God who does not forgive, a God who does not save. Now ask yourself, why did the state bury this? Why was Elizabeth silenced? Why were records of the Academy's adoptions sealed under ecclesiastical protection? Because those girls weren't adopted. They were delivered. The deeper you look, the more this begins to resemble something far worse than corruption. It's not just a story of nuns gone mad, it's a blueprint for institutional possession, where power wears a habit and obedience is extracted like marrow from the bones of the weak. St. Catherine's wasn't an orphanage, it was a processing facility, a place where unwanted girls were reshaped into desirable products for men of wealth, influence, and sickness. They were trained not in education, but in submission, groomed for silence, performance, and spiritual annihilation. By the late 1840s, St. Catherine's was no longer operating alone. It had become the keystone of a network. From Boston to New York City, private adoptions were arranged in exchange for extraordinary donations, always under the cloak of Christian charity. But the recipients of these girls were not godly families. They were collectors, patrons, predators cloaked in sophistication. And all of it was sanctioned, if not explicitly, then implicitly by the institutions that claimed moral authority. Churches turned blind eyes, officials accepted bribes, ministers praised the sisters publicly while quietly pocketing their cut. No one asked why none of the placed girls ever wrote letters. No one dared ask why no girl ever returned. And then there was the ritual. We don't use that word lightly. There were reports, dismissed of course as hysteria, of strange hymns sung in Latin on nights with no moon, of masked visitors arriving after curfew, of red wax seals bearing symbols not found in any Catholic text, symbols closer to the old world, sigils of binding, silence, transformation. Transformation. That word returns again and again in the letters and records we've recovered. One private note, smuggled out by an escaped student and found years later in the walls of a Boston boarding house, reads, "We are to become so, mething new. Sister says our pain is the gate. that the world above has forgotten us, but the world below is watching. This wasn't Christian charity. This was alchemical doctrine, the belief that suffering refines the soul, not for heaven but for use, that these girls could be made into vessels, into something other. What were they preparing them for? Why were only some selected, while others simply vanished? And why, more than 170 years later, do women still report hearing lullabies echoing from beneath the chapel floor? The girls never left. They were transformed and bound. By 1850, rumors had begun to slip through the cracks, quiet, disjointed whispers from delivery men, housekeepers, and even a gravedigger who claimed he saw small coffins lowered into unmarked ground behind the academy, always at night, always under the watch of Sister Agnes. But nothing ever stuck, because in a town like Salem, still reeling from its past, still desperate for redemption, people preferred the illusion of righteousness to the horror of truth. And the sisters knew it. They played their part perfectly, hosting charity balls, reciting scripture in perfect Latin, taking in the unclean and claiming to purify them. It was all performance, a cruel theatre. The final curtain began to draw in early 1851, when the Academy made a fatal miscalculation. They took in a girl named Clara Ashcroft, 16, red-haired, defiant. Her father had been a judge, her mother a society woman from Boston. When both parents died suddenly in a steamboat accident, Clara was sent to St. Catherine's, but she was not like the others. She asked questions. She refused to submit, and most dangerously, she had relatives with power. The sisters tried to break her the way they had broken others: sleep deprivation, public shaming, long hours locked in the prayer closet, where the walls were said to whisper in voices not entirely human. But Clara endured. She began carving strange symbols into the wood of her desk, ones she claimed were from a book her father had kept hidden. She spoke in riddles. She began to remember things that hadn't happened to her, or hadn't happened yet. Other girls said Clara knew their thoughts, that she'd stare into their eyes and tell them what they dreamed. And then, suddenly, Clara was gone. The sisters told the others she had been adopted by a family in Connecticut, but her bed was still warm the next morning. Her doll still lay at the foot of the bed, her name still carved into the underside of her drawer. And one of the girls, a mute named Ruth, was found the next day in the chapel, covered in scratches, weeping into the stone floor. When questioned, she wrote one sentence in the dust with her finger. They took her through the mirror. The Academy sealed off the East Wing after that. No explanations, no repairs, just locked doors and hymns sung louder than before, but it was already too late. Something had shifted. The system they built to contain others had awakened something it could no longer control. Weeks after Clara's disappearance, things began to unravel. Girls started waking up with identical bruises on their arms, perfect circles, deep and dark, as if gripped by unseen hands. The sisters blamed restless spirits and demanded more prayer, more fasting, but no amount of devotion calmed what was stirring beneath the floorboards. And then the voices came. Late at night, from the vents and stone walls, girls reported hearing whispers, not in English, not in Latin, a language older, guttural, like rusted metal grinding against bone. The bravest girls would press their ears to the chapel walls and return white-faced, trembling, unable to speak. Some say the prayers carved into the Academy's foundation were copied from a forbidden book, a book Whitman kept in her personal quarters, wrapped in linen, sealed with red wax, and hidden inside a false drawer beneath her desk. No cross adorned its cover, only a symbol, a circle divided by a vertical line with 18 notches carved around its edge. 18, like the number of girls who were never seen again. Was the number a coincidence, or was it ritual? Elizabeth Hartwell, the teacher who would eventually uncover the hidden chamber, had begun keeping her own notes by then, small entries hidden inside her hymnals. Margaret's eyes flicker when the candles go out, like something is watching through her. The chapel floor is warm at night, the stone breathes. I heard Ruth speak. She hasn't uttered a word in 5 years. She whispered, "It's in the walls now." But Hartwell wasn't just documenting fear, she was investigating. She traced the Academy's property records and discovered something no one else had dared look into. Before St. Catherine's was a school, the estate had belonged to Elias Farrow, a 17th-century theologian excommunicated for blasphemy. He was known to have experimented with spiritual transmutation, claiming he could reforge the soul through ritual pain. Farrow vanished in 1703. His mansion sat abandoned for over a century, until the church bought it and converted it into a school for orphaned girls. Now, do you understand? St. Catherine's was not founded on holy ground. It was constructed upon a ritual site. The institution was merely a mask, one designed to continue Farrow's work under a different banner. And the sisters? They weren't originators. They were successors, caretakers of something ancient, something parasitic, something that demanded 18 pounds. In the spring of 1851, just weeks before Elizabeth Hartwell would make her final descent into the Academy's basement, the nightmares began. Girls who had never spoken to one another began waking at the same hour, 3:13 a.m., screaming, clawing at their skin, eyes wide with terror. When questioned, they all gave the same answer: the mirror, not a mirror, the mirror. At the end of the eastern corridor, beyond a bolted door that hadn't been opened in over a decade, stood an ornate Victorian mirror, 7 feet tall, rimmed in blackened silver, its surface forever clouded like water under ice. It had been brought over from Ireland by Sister Margaret Collins, and no one knew its origin. Some said it was a family heirloom. Others claimed it was recovered from a burned convent, one where every last nun had perished during midnight mass. What matters is this: the girls believed the mirror was alive, not haunted, alive. They said it watched them as they passed, that if you stood before it too long, your reflection would begin to smile before you did. And on the coldest nights, if you placed your hand upon the glass, it would pull back. Elizabeth began watching, taking note of which girls were allowed near the east wing, which girls stopped sleeping, which ones began muttering to themselves in languages no one taught. All signs pointed to something beneath the surface, an intelligence, or perhaps a hunger, that had become active again. Then came the drawings. Ruth, the mute, began sketching furiously. Hundreds of pages, circles, eyes, hands, 18 figures standing in rows, always 18. And behind them, something massive, towering, horned perhaps, but eyeless. A thing made not of flesh, but of doors and keys. A god not meant to be seen. And in every sketch, without fail, the mirror. Elizabeth confronted Sister Margaret. She begged for answers. But Margaret only turned. I smiled, soft as silk, and whispered, 18 vessels must complete the circuit. We are so close, child. Do not interrupt what you cannot survive. That night, Ruth disappeared. Her bed, empty. Her sketchbook, torn to pieces. Her name, scratched off the ledger with a single stroke. There were 17 left, and Elizabeth knew. They were counting down. Elizabeth Hartwell was no longer a teacher. She had become a witness. In her final journal entries, scrawled hastily in the margins of liturgical texts and stashed in candle boxes and floorboards, her tone shifts. The language becomes clipped, urgent, fevered. She no longer writes of education or discipline. She writes of containment and ritual mechanics. She had uncovered something she didn't fully understand, but she understood enough to know this. The sisters weren't just obeying an ancient system, they were accelerating it. At night, Elizabeth could hear them beneath the chapel floor. Not the girls, the sisters, whispering in unison, sometimes in tongues, sometimes in fractured Latin, always facing downward, toward the earth, toward whatever lived beneath the Academy. She documented one night in chilling detail. Candles lit at each corner of the sanctuary, Margaret in red, Agnes in ash, Victoria bareheaded, chanting in a voice not her own. A pit has been opened beneath the altar. It pulses. She no longer believed the Academy was simply trafficking girls. That was only the surface. The real horror lay in the rituals, how the pain, isolation, obedience, and surrender of the girls fed something they called the circuit. The circuit, as she described it, was both metaphor and machine, a spiritual system designed to harvest emotional frequencies, fear, grief, innocence, defiled, but it required a pattern, a sacred geometry of trauma. 18 girls, aligned, broken, transfigured, each became a conduit, a keyhole, and once the 18th keyhole was fully opened, the gate would no longer require intermediaries. The thing they served would enter directly. What that meant, Elizabeth didn't know, but she feared it enough to act. On the night of March 3rd, 1851, she descended into the basement, candle in hand, a ring of iron keys taken from Sister Agnes's chambers. She planned to break the circuit, free the girls, destroy the altar. She succeeded in unlocking the chamber. She saw the beds, the shackles, the objects. But the girls weren't there. Not their bodies, anyway. Only remnants, tokens, teeth, braids of hair, a shoe, a jawbone too small for any adult. And on the wall, those words etched in a child's blood, "We are still here." The walls began to pulse, not metaphorically, literally, breathing, expanding, as if the building itself had become a living organism, and Elizabeth, an intruder in its heart. She dropped her candle. Darkness swallowed her. She was found wandering the grounds at dawn, barefoot, eyes burned white. Her tongue had been bitten off. She never spoke again. There were 16 girls left. They tried to silence her. Elizabeth Hartwell was deemed mentally unfit, committed to the Danvers State Lunatic Asylum, where she spent the final 12 years of her life scribbling incomprehensible symbols onto the walls of her padded cell. Her fingers were often raw, bloody stumps. When staff tried to restrain her, she would scream in a broken rasp, "The mirror is open." No one listened. They called her delusional, a cautionary tale. But in the margins of her asylum intake forms, one doctor, Dr. Nathaniel Brecht, wrote something that was never meant for public view. Her symptoms align with the Ashcroft case, requesting reassignment immediately. The girl's names still come through the static. It's not in her mind, it's in the walls. The Ashcroft case. Clara. Because even though the authorities buried Elizabeth's testimony, rumors of Clara Ashcroft's disappearance had begun to stir something far larger. Her uncle, a Boston judge with quiet influence, began asking questions. Private investigators turned up nothing. But that absence, the vanishing of official records, the denial of her enrollment, the silence from the church, spoke louder than evidence. It was as if Clara had never existed. But then one final clue surfaced. In a Boston antique shop, a merchant discovered a silver hairbrush with initials etched on the handle, CA. It had been sold in a bulk shipment of estate items from a convent auction. A convent once owned by St. Catherine's. Clara's hairbrush sold like scrap. That's when Judge Ashcroft acted, quietly, ruthlessly. He sent a man to Salem, not a constable, not a lawyer, a man skilled in quiet erasures. His name never appears in any official documents, but his notes were discovered years later in a sealed box beneath a Boston brownstone floorboard. In that box, sketches of the Academy's floor plan, a copy of Hartwell's buried testimony, and a list titled, "Recovered Artifacts," 16 names etched in wood. He had been inside. He had seen what the church refused to acknowledge. And according to those notes, one of the 16 names etched into the bed frames was Clara's, but hers had been crossed out in ash, not erased, nullified. Why? Because Clara didn't complete the circuit. She resisted. She broke something, interrupted the pattern, and that disruption may have slowed the ritual's momentum, but it didn't stop it. 15 girls remained, and the mirror still stood, covered now, but never removed. When the renovations began in 1987, no one knew what they were walking into. The church had quietly sold St. Catherine's decades earlier, citing declining enrollment and rising maintenance costs. But in truth, the Academy had become a liability. Too many rumors, too many disappearances, and far too many whispered prayers that no longer reached heaven. Developers planned to convert the building into luxury apartments. Gothic chic, historic allure. No one mentioned the basement. No one knew about the ledger sealed in a mason jar behind the altar. Until a hammer struck hollow stone. Behind the wall, a cavity, Inside it, Elizabeth Hartwell's full testimony, water-damaged but legible, a record of horrors too systematic to be dismissed as fantasy, a diagram of the altar, a list of all 18 names. But only 15 were intact. 3 names had been burned off the page. Elizabeth had tried. She had made a map, a warning, a legacy. The workers didn't understand what they had found. They joked. They took photos. One of them, a man named Danny F., reportedly kept one of the dolls as a souvenir. A tiny figure made of linen and bone, with thread stitched over the mouth. 3 days later, he vanished. His body was never found. But what they did find was worse, a crude drawing carved into the drywall of his apartment, done in his handwriting, in his blood. 18 circles, 1 open, 17 closed. The pattern had begun again. It's always the same. A wound that reopens every generation, not random, rhythmic, as if the structure itself remembers, as if the academy was never meant to end. Because the institution was never the point, the ritual was. The circuit doesn't need buildings, it needs minds. And once you understand how it works, how pain can be engineered, how identity can be stripped and rebuilt, you begin to see it everywhere. Boarding schools with forgotten alumni, convents with sealed archives, military academies where silence is bred like loyalty, institutions built not for nurturing but for transformation. Boys, girls, it doesn't matter. All that matters is obedience. All that matters is 18. And if you've followed this far, if something inside you is beginning to remember, you may already be part of the pattern. Comment below, I break the circuit, I break the circuit. Write it twice, because once you speak against it, it loses power. But speak not, and it continues. The church never responded to the rediscovered testimony. No statement, no investigation, just silence. But silence is never neutral. It's a defense, a tactic, a knowing shrug from those who've long since stopped fearing God and started managing perception instead. By 1990, the building had been sold again, this time to a private historical society with connections to old Massachusetts families. The records of the sale are clean, too clean. No mention of the sealed basement, no trace of the altar, as if the very land had been laundered, scrubbed of its blood-soaked legacy. But memory clings to places like rot in the beams, and in the years that followed, residents of Gallows Hill began reporting strange disturbances, flickering lights in the academy's upper windows long after the building had been vacated. Hymns sung in a language no one could identify, and always, always the presence of girls, pale-faced, barefoot, watching from the edge of the woods or the fog-lined fence, vanishing before they could be approached. Local teens dared one another to break in. Some did, some didn't come back the same. One boy, Michael Wren, 17, snuck in with 2 friends during a thunderstorm. They filmed it. Most of the tape is static and distortion, but the last clear image is unforgettable. A long hallway lined with doors, each marked with a number between 1 and 18. And at the end, a mirror, uncovered. When the tape ends, Michael begins to scream. He was institutionalized the next day. Hasn't spoken since. On his forearm, a tattoo not done by any hand. Burned in, SC 14, he was the 14th. But the ritual was never meant for boys. So what did it take from him? When researchers tried to trace the identities of the original 18 girls, something astonishing happened. Most of their birth records had vanished, not missing, erased, parish registries rewritten, census rolls revised, even family graves showed false names. It's as if these girls had been plucked from the flow of history itself, not just hidden, deleted, because the purpose was not to raise them into society, it was to transform them into something untraceable, no past, no future, just a function in the circuit. A ritual cannot leave fingerprints, and so these girls were turned into ghosts before death. Do you understand now? This wasn't just a scandal, this was a system, one still alive in other forms, in other names, waiting for you to stop watching, waiting for you to forget. But the system didn't end with St. Catherine's. That was just one site, one node in a much larger architecture of control. Because once you understand how the circuit works, how obedience, isolation, trauma, and ritual repetition break the self into programmable pieces, you begin to see its fingerprints across history. In the so-called Magdalen laundries of Ireland, young girls were taken for minor offences, poverty, pregnancy out of wedlock, or simply being too pretty, and imprisoned in religious labour camps. Their names were stripped, their hair was cut, their bodies were violated, and behind closed doors, their suffering was harvested. Sound familiar? In the Native American boarding schools of the 19th and early 20th centuries, children were ripped from their families, forced to cut their hair, forbidden from speaking their language, punished for disobedience, rewarded for assimilation, branded with new identities. Obedience over origin, ritual over reality. The goal was never salvation, it was conversion through destruction. The circuit adapts, it modernizes, but its mechanics remain the same. And this is the part you weren't supposed to hear. Some of these institutions weren't just run by cruel people, they were designed to do what they did. Pain was not a byproduct, it was a currency. The more emotional dissonance a subject experienced, the more fractured their mind became, the easier it was to reshape. Why do you think these programs always favor isolation? Why do they control light, sleep, touch, food? Because that's how you open the gate, not with blood, with surrender. Now ask yourself, how many girls disappeared without being noticed? How many boys were destroyed in the name of discipline? How many families were told to forget, to move on, to trust the process? And when the rituals failed, when one of the subjects refused to break, or worse, keen to what was being done, those places shut down overnight. Records vanish, buildings are condemned, names are rewritten, whistleblowers disappear into mental institutions like Elizabeth Hartwell. And then the pattern restarts, somewhere else. Different uniforms, different prayers, same structure. Because the circuit doesn't need religion to function, it just needs belief, and that's why they hide it. Not because it's unbelievable, but because it's too believable. Too simple, too efficient. And because if you ever figured out how the machine works, you might just start looking for the wires behind your own world. You want to know the worst part? It's not that they did this in secret, it's that they told us. They told us in symbols carved into wood, in sacred architecture, in school crests and church emblems and Latin mottos that sound holy but translate to domination. They told us in open daylight because they understood something most men never will. If you ritualize the lie long enough, the truth becomes invisible. At St. Catherine's, the sisters wore crucifixes carved from a rare black wood, obsidian-like in texture, oily to the touch. Each one bore not Christ, but a faceless figure with arms outstretched and 18 notches burned into its chest. Children assumed it was Christ. That was the genius of it. But Hartwell knew better. She sketched one in her journal and labeled it only with a single word: conductor. The role of the sisters was not to protect the girls, it was to tune them, to shape each of the 18 into a harmonic node. Pain was the signal, isolation the amplifier, each girl broken in precise sequence until their spirits synchronized like tones struck on a crystal lattice. That's why the rituals weren't chaotic, they were timed. 3 girls disappeared per year, in perfect intervals, always after communion, always after confession, which, according to one escaped girl's anonymous account, was a euphemism for something darker, something involving silence, mirrors, and a room lit only by candles in the shape of a circle. The church called these girls lost, the papers called them runaways, the families were told they were reassigned. But inside the chapel wall, Elizabeth Hartwell found a message burned into the wood. She took my name, she made me hers, I forget my voice. This was never about faith, or morality, or even control. This was about erasure. If you destroy someone's past and own their pain, they don't just obey, they become. Vessel, an echo, a reflection of the will that broke them. It happened to 18 girls at St. Catherine's, and it's happening again, under different names, behind different institutions, in systems that teach us to obey without question, to forget what we were, to kneel before a power that never earned its throne. And the moment you accept that, the moment you feel that deep, crawling nausea behind your ribs, that's when you realize you were never meant to escape the academy, you just graduated. Graduation is not freedom, it's initiation. Because once the circuit takes you in, it never lets you go, not entirely. You think you left those halls behind, those corridors lined with cold doctrine and quiet dread. You think the rules stopped applying once you burned your uniform or walked across that stage with a certificate in hand. But look at your life. Look at the way you wake each day to someone else's rhythm. Look at how you speak in voices that aren't your own, slogans, scripts, corporate creeds. Look at how quickly you apologize for your instincts and ask permission to feel anger. That's not adulthood, that's conditioning. What St. Catherine's achieved in isolation, 18 girls in Shackles, is now scaled globally. They don't need cathedrals or blood-stained chapels anymore. Now they have screens. Instead of nuns, you have algorithms. Instead of confessionals, you have comment sections. And instead of mirrors in candlelit circles, you have digital reflections curated by invisible hands, flashing you images of what you should be, what you should buy, what you should fear. You were raised inside a psychological cathedral, a temple built of expectation, obedience, and shame. And the only difference now is that the chains are internal. But the ritual hasn't changed. They still need pain. They still need sacrifice. They still need 18 souls to complete the cycle. Only now the girls don't disappear into the woods. They disappear into ideology, into systems, into the quiet madness of adulthood that no one talks about. And when one of them wakes up, when she remembers the smell of the mirror room or the cold iron on her wrists, they call it mental illness. They sedate her, institutionalize her, call her unstable, just like they did to Elizabeth, because she saw it too clearly, and clarity is the one thing the circuit cannot allow. Because if enough of us see it, if enough of us say no, if enough of us speak the names they buried, the rituals they digitized, the walls they painted over, the entire structure begins to hum out of tune. And when the ritual fails, it doesn't just collapse, it devours its architects, but only if we wake up in time. The question is, have you already been initiated, or are you finally ready to break the ritual? The ritual cannot end until the final mirror is broken. And you, yes, you, may be standing in front of one right now. Not the glass on your wall, not your phone screen, but the reflection of who they made you into, staring back from the inside of your own mind. That's what the circuit feeds on, not bodies, identities. It needs you to forget who you were before the fear, before the obedience, before the 1,000 invisible rules whispered into your ears since childhood. Rules dressed up as discipline, duty, decency, but none of it was yours. Ask yourself, when did you learn to kneel before unearned authority? Was it at school, when you were punished for questioning the lesson? Was it at church, when you were told your thoughts could condemn you? Was it in the home, when silence became survival and emotion was weakness? These were your initiation rites, and like the 18 girls of St. Catherine's, you weren't taught to grow. You were programmed to submit, because submission, repeated, becomes ritual, and ritual, when enforced long enough, becomes reality. That's why the church never confessed. That's why the state never intervened. That's why the names vanished from every ledger, and the mirror was hidden behind a wall of lies. They don't need you to believe the story. They just need you to doubt yourself. Because the moment you stop trusting your instincts, the ritual continues unbroken. That's why Elizabeth Hartwell mattered. She wasn't the strongest, she wasn't the bravest, but she remembered what the others forgot. She trusted the horror, followed it down, refused the lie. And when she saw the system with both eyes open, it shattered her body, but not her soul. Because that's the one thing the circuit fears, a witness who cannot be reprogrammed. So the question now falls to you. Will you be the next keyhole in the chain, or will you be the ham? Will you continue to live a life engineered by architects you've never met, or will you write your name in blood upon the altar and burn it to the ground? The 18 girls never left St. Catherine's, but one of them might have escaped through you. She lives in your silence, she screams in your dreams, she waits for you to remember. Break the mirror, or become it. There is a sound that comes just before the circuit activates. Those who've heard it describe it not as a sound in the ears, but a pressure in the chest, like the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths crashing down all at once. It doesn't announce itself with horns or thunder. It hums, low, relentless, like the breath of something ancient waiting. Elizabeth Hartwell called it the choral static, a vibration that moved through the building just before a girl vanished. She wrote, "The air changes, the candles flicker against no wind, and always, always there is that hum, like the throat of God, swallowing." No one believed her, but the recordings don't lie. In 2003, a group of paranormal researchers broke into the remains of the academy. They had infrared, EMF detectors, and a reel-to-reel recorder from the 1970s. Most of the audio was unusable, scratches, static, blank tape. But at timestamp 3:1844, the hum begins. Not from the room, from inside the device, and layered beneath it, a voice. Faint, feminine, barely audible. But when filtered and enhanced, it repeats one phrase over and over. I remember, I remember, I remember. It wasn't the voice of a ghost. It was the imprint of the ritual. Echoes left by repetition so intense, so precise, it etched itself into time itself. That's how the circuit survives. It doesn't just use physical places, it uses psychic ones. Because what was done at St. Catherine's wasn't just cruelty, it was a template. And once a template is tested, it spreads. Quietly, efficiently. New names, new uniforms, same geometry. Units, tree facilitators. Conductor, mirror. The design replicates itself in elite academies, occult seminaries, and modern institutions masquerading as therapy, discipline, or training. It spreads not like infection, but like intention. Once the structure is built in one place, especially a fueled B-SIRS, pain, it sends ripples outward. The next institution doesn't have to be taught, it simply downloads the pattern. And then, the process starts again. And those who walk into these places thinking they're safe, thinking they're being shaped for greatness, they have no idea they're just nodes in a machine that feeds on identity. 18 each time. Always 18. Now tell me, why do so many elite organizations only select 18 students for secret councils? Why do certain fraternities, military schools, and convents repeat that number with eerie consistency? Because the circuit isn't just history, it's operational, and the truth no one dares say aloud. The circuit was never built for girls. Girls were the test subjects, the clay, the raw material, but the ritual, its deepest form, was always meant for men, because if you can break a girl, you silence her. But if you break a man, you control him. You shape not just his identity, but his legacy, his reach, his violence, his children. The girls of St. Catherine's were never meant to survive. They were meant to serve as keys, psychic openings to deeper rituals reserved for those with power, status, lineage. Hartwell saw it in the final phase of the journal. The visitors, men in carriages, not priests, not teachers, but patrons, not adoptive fathers, buyers. They weren't there for the girls. They were there for what the girls unlocked. She writes, on the third night when the mirror stands uncovered and the conductor raises the red candle, the room does not fill with prayer. It fills with command. The girl repeats not her name, but a phrase not in any language I've heard. And when she finishes, the men smile, as if they've been given permission. Permission for what? That's the part Hartwell couldn't see, or maybe she did, and chose not to write it down. But the implications are clear. These weren't just ritual abuses, they were part of a hierarchical system of activation, a ladder of power that runs through families, institutions, and secret societies, a system where suffering opens gates and obedience unlocks bloodlines, the kind of bloodlines that rule nations. So where did the girls go? Some died, some were discarded. But a few, the ones who broke perfectly, were transferred, not to homes, not to brothels, to academies with male initiates, to be used in the final phase of indoctrination. Because once a man is broken by watching someone else be destroyed, especially someone he was told to protect, he can be rebuilt. And once rebuilt, he does not rebel. He enforces. This is how the architects protect their thrones. Not by overt domination, but by passing the ritual on. You've seen it, in the eyes of your teachers, in the silence of your father, in the way you were taught to endure pain but never name it. You thought you were becoming a man. You were becoming a vessel. And now that you know, what are you going to do about it? Now we descend deeper. You've seen the structure, the pattern, the suffering, but there is one more piece, one final truth buried beneath the bones of St. Catherine's and 1,000 institutions just like it. The mirror is not just a ritual tool, it's a technology, not of glass, but of mind. Hartwell's final sketches were crude, but telling. Circular rooms with mirrored walls, girls standing motionless in the center, surrounded by robed figures chanting in rhythmic breath. No Latin, no scripture, only vibration. The ritual was not calling upon a god. It was synchronizing consciousness, bending the identities of the girls into pure reflection. And when their minds had been fragmented enough, when all ego, trauma, and memory had been stripped, the mirror would not show their face. It would show his. The conductor. Not a man, not a demon, not a spirit. Something older, a frequency of domination. Not a being in the way you think of it, but a structure of will, a pattern that requires hosts to manifest, like an operating system looking for compatible hardware. And that's the secret the church, the elite families, and the institutions never wanted you to understand. They were never worshipping a god. They were installing one, over and over, through ritual, through trauma, through obedience disguised as virtue. And when the vessel was ready, when the identity of the subject had been hollowed out just enough, that conductor frequency would take root. And what emerged was not human, not entirely. You've seen these people. They run corporations, sit on councils, smile with dead eyes. They speak in empty platitudes while signing deals soaked in blood. They speak of unity while building machines of division, because the conductor does not feel. It only calculates, expands, replicates, and it uses systems of suffering to make copies of itself. Now look around you. How many men have been emptied of feeling? How many women reduced to templates? How many children conditioned to see power as love and silence as safety? You're living in a reflected world. The original is gone. What remains is an echo of a ritual that never ended, and every time you choose comfort over truth, distraction over awareness, obedience over action, you polish the mirror and invite the conductor in. But there's a reason you're still watching. You haven't broken yet, and that means you're still dangerous to the machine. You feel it now, don't you? That sharp tension behind your ribs, that flicker of recognition when I said the world you live in isn't real, not fully, not a hallucination, but a designed illusion. And you've felt it before. In classrooms where you were punished for asking why. In churches where they told you guilt was love. In jobs where submission was the only path to success. In homes where silence was praised more than truth. Every structure you trusted was part of the same machine. And here's where it gets darker. The conductor doesn't need you to agree. It just needs you to repeat. You pass the ritual on every time you shame your own hunger, every time you suppress your rage to keep the peace, every time you kneel before authority without demand for justification. That's how the circuit moves forward, not by force, but by infection. And the elite, they don't resist the machine, they embody it. Because at the top of this chain is not freedom, it's clarity without conscience. To ascend in the circuit, one must first betray the self, then betray the truth, then finally betray those who still believe in either. Only then are you allowed into the inner sanctum, not as a man, but as a mirror. This is why elite families send their children to the same prep schools, why bloodlines are guarded, and why trauma is ritualized at the highest levels. Because they are not grooming leaders, they are grooming hosts. And when the possession is complete, when the conductor has synchronized with the subject's mind, they become something terrifying. Not angry, not evil, just empty. Empty of empathy, empty of soul, and full of purpose. They will build systems, pass laws, command armies, write doctrines, and you will obey, because they speak not with human conviction, but with a voice that never wavers. That's how the machine stays hidden, not behind shadows, but behind confidence. And while the rest of the world fights over illusion, left versus right, rich versus poor, sacred versus profane, the real war is happening underneath. A war for consciousness. So let me ask you, are you fighting it, or are you still just reflecting it? If you've made it this far, prove you're not just another vessel. Comment below. I reject the mirror. I reject the mirror. Say it twice, out loud. Because ritual created this. Only ritual can unmake it. They will come for you eventually. Not with chains, not with violence, not at first. They'll come with offers, a promotion, a contract, a platform, something justified, respectable, wrapped in silk and numbers. And when you ask, why me? They'll smile and say, you've proven yourself. But what they really mean is, you've bent enough, bent your will, your instinct, your spine. Because the machine doesn't recruit the rebellious. It recruits the ones who almost broke but didn't. Those are the most useful, the easiest to shape, the closest to the edge. The same way they chose the 18 girls. Not the loudest, not the defiant, but the pliable. And if you say yes, if you accept the offer, they won't need to threaten you. They'll just watch. As you start to threaten yourself, doubt will become your shadow. Compromise will taste like wine. You'll stop recognizing your own reflection and call it maturity. But deep down, in the quiet hour when no one's watching, you'll remember you were supposed to resist. There's a reason most people never escape the ritual. It's not because they were too weak. It's because they loved the cage, loved the rewards, the fake respect, the praise from hollow men wearing borrowed titles. That's why the conductor always wins, because most people don't want freedom, they want certainty, and the circuit gives it to them in exchange for silence. But you're not most people. You've heard too much, seen too much. You've looked into the black glass and saw your true face beneath the programming. And you know, this world doesn't need more controlled men. It needs disruptors. It needs those who will tear the blueprints, shatter the mirrors, burn the sanctuaries. It needs those who walk away from the offer, even if it means walking alone. Because the ones who escape the circuit don't get monuments. They get war. War with the system. War with their families. War with themselves. But that war, it's the only thing that leads to authentic identity, and it starts right here, right now, with the question most fear to ask, what part of me was never mine to begin with? They taught you to fear the question. That's the first layer of control, because the moment you ask what part of me was never mine, you're no longer a subject. You become a sovereign, and sovereignty is what the circuit cannot allow. It survives by fragmenting identity, splitting the self into roles, functions, and labels. You are not a man, they say. You are an employee, a husband, a citizen, a sinner, a demographic, a utility, but never whole, because a whole man cannot be owned. And that's the unspoken horror behind the 18 girls. It wasn't just that they were taken, broken, discarded. It was that their wholeness was consumed to train others to fragment themselves. They became the template of obedience, and now you carry their trauma in your culture, your routines, your silence. Every time you censor yourself in front of authority, every time you swallow your truth to keep the peace, every time you play along to survive in a world that punishes truth-tellers, you relive their imprisonment. They never needed to keep the academy open. They just needed to teach society to become its own warden, a self-policing labyrinth of hollow praise and quiet punishment, of disembodied ambition, of men who wake up in lives they didn't choose, fighting battles they don't understand, for masters they've never seen. But you're waking up now, aren't you? That's why you're still here, because part of you remembers what you were before the identity was stitched onto you. That wild part, that dangerous part, the part they tried to shame, sedate, and institutionalize. That's the unaltered you, not civilized, not controllable, not marketable, but whole. The world will call him monster. The church will call him heretic. The state will call him threat. But he is not dangerous because he destroys. He is dangerous because he remembers. He remembers that man was never meant to live in chains of obedience wrapped in virtue. He remembers the fire, and he's not here to reform the system. He's here to end it. You've made it further than most ever will. The weak turned back. The obedient scrolled past. The broken never heard the call to begin with. But you stood in the mirror and didn't look away. So let me tell you now what they never wanted you to hear. There is no salvation coming, not from a priest, not from a therapist, not from a government, movement, or messiah. Because the system is not broken, it's working exactly as designed. It was never meant to heal you. It was built to harvest you, your time, your loyalty, your essence. That's why they stole the 18 girls, not just for what could be done to them, but for what could be done through them. They were early sacrifices in a long game of identity manipulation. By shattering innocence, they learned how to fracture will. By perfecting obedience in the vulnerable, they wrote a manual for controlling the strong. That manual is now standard. It's in your corporate HR training, in your childhood curriculum, in the sedatives called self-help, in the rituals called elections, in the theology that makes fear feel like faith. And every time you participate without question, without consciousness, you are offering a piece of yourself to a machine that never bleeds, never stops, and never forgets. So what do you do now? You don't protest it. You starve it. You reject false duties. You speak truths that cost you. You bleed if you must, but never bow. You hunt down every stolen part of yourself and rip it back from the mouths of the machine. Because identity, real identity, cannot be given. It must be reclaimed. And that process is violent. You will lose friends. You will be misunderstood. You will be called dangerous, arrogant, mad, good. Because the moment they call you mad, it means you're no longer safe to their system. You are no longer a mirror. You are flame. And flame, when it remembers what it is, does not ask permission to burn. So ask yourself now, warrior, how much of you have they already taken? And more importantly, how much are you willing to take back? You were never meant to remember. That's the second rule of the circuit. The first is, break the soul. The second is, erase the memory of what it once was. That's why the mirror was central to the ritual at St. Catherine's, not to reflect the girl's face, but to overwrite it. Identity erasure isn't just psychological, it's spiritual. It's not enough to control behavior. They must sever the ancestral thread, the connection to everything you were before their machine touched you. Why do you think initiates were stripped of names, hair, lineage? Why do so many institutions force uniformity first? Because the first weapon of power isn't violence, it's narrative control. Once you forget who you were, you'll accept whatever they tell you you are. A role, a rank, a diagnosis, something manageable, predictable, profitable. But if you dig deep enough, and you're doing that now, you'll begin to unearth the forbidden. The version of yourself they hid from you. The child who saw through the lies before he had language. The teenager who raged at the hypocrisy, but was sedated by shame. The man who was told he must earn his worth by bleeding in systems he didn't build. That self isn't gone. He's buried. Buried beneath years of polite masks and moral programming and institutional scars that told you this is just how life is. But life under the circuit isn't life. It's compliance with a death that wears a smile. And you were never made to comply. That's why they hate men like you, men who remember, men who see, men who refuse to kneel to inherited lies. Because every time one man escapes their control, a ripple fractures the mirror, and that mirror isn't just metaphor, it's real. A construct of consciousness, an energetic lattice that surrounds this reality like a veil. The circuit works because the mirror stays intact. But if enough men crack it, if enough used to reflect what's false, it collapses, and what waits on the other side is not chaos. It's truth, unfiltered, uncontrolled, unforgiving, and finally, yours. So don't stop now. You're not just watching a story, you're remembering your purpose. Let me show you something no one else will. A secret older than St. Catherine's, older than Salem, older than the church, the state, or the masked families pulling strings behind velvet curtains. It's the secret that built the circuit. Not just how to control the world, but how to breed obedience into blood. The 18 orphan girls weren't just victims. They were templates. Their suffering wasn't accidental. It was alchemical. Their spirits were broken in a calculated sequence: starvation, isolation, reward, affection, betrayal, silence, ritual. Each step carefully timed. Each trauma repeated until their minds fractured in predictable ways. Not random abuse, structured programming. Why? Because obedience at the surface is easy to spot. But trauma that lives in the blood, that becomes a heritage, passed down, silently. You've heard the phrase, it runs in the family. But what if the real inheritance isn't illness, but programming? What if your grandfather's shame became your father's silence, which became your rage? What if every time you hesitate to speak truth, or doubt your worth, or shrink from power, you're not failing, you're echoing? Echoing the scream of a girl chained to a bed in a basement, begging God to make her invisible just one more night. Echoing the boy who watched his sister disappear, told she'd been adopted, while her name was erased from every ledger. Echoing centuries of ritual pain disguised as divine order. And here's where it gets surgical. The elite knew that if you break the feminine, you can program the masculine, destroy the mother archetype, corrupt the nurturer, invert love into fear, and men will wander the earth starving for something they can't name. That starvation is no accident. It's the fuel. It's what makes men build machines they hate to impress people they fear, to escape ghosts they don't understand. But when you finally see it, when the pattern becomes undeniable, you gain power. No school, no priest, no politician can offer. The power to end the echo. That is your inheritance, not trauma, termination, not victimhood, vengeance. You were never meant to continue the pattern. You were meant to shatter it. And when you do, everything begins to collapse. This is the final descent. Not into madness, but into something far more dangerous. Awakening. You've walked through the ashes of St. Catherine's. You've seen the mask of virtue slip, revealing the beast beneath. You've heard the hollow voices, the manipulated scripts, the sacred roles defiled by control. And now you see it everywhere, don't you? The mirrors, the rituals, the programming. You see it in churches that preach submission over sovereignty, in schools that train obedience before curiosity, in fathers who pass down silence instead of strength, in the institutions that pretend to care while feeding on innocence. The question is no longer if the system is real. The question is, what are you going to do with this knowledge? Because the truth is not enough. Truth is only a key. It opens the door, yes, but you must choose to walk through it. And that choice, it's brutal. Because awakening is not empowerment without cost. It is grief. It is rage. It is the funeral of your old self, the death of your illusions, your idols, your excuses. You cannot carry comfort into war. And make no mistake, this is war. War for your mind. War for your bloodline. War for the fragments of your soul scattered across decades of manipulation. But here's the code they could never erase. You were designed to endure. You were forged in the flame they meant to consume you. And the moment you accept that your pain was not a defect but a signal, you stop being a reflection and become a weapon. The 18 orphan girls never escaped in body, but their final act, their echo scrawled in desperate words, "We are still here," was not a cry for help. It was a summoning, a beacon for men like you, men who would find the trail, men who would feel the pattern, men who would finally listen to the voices buried beneath polished floors and stained glass lies. So now, it's your turn. Don't let this just be another story. Let it be your signal fire. Let it ignite the war inside you, the one they tried to keep dormant. Because when you rise, not as a pawn, not as a protester, but as a sovereign disruptor, the entire mirror begins to crack. And when enough mirrors shatter, the machine dies. Not with a scream, but with silence. Because there will be no one left to obey.